Hello, my friends. Welcome back to Non-Toxic Environments. This is your host, Andy Pace. This week, we have another special program. We have with us Jenny Johnson. And if you don't know Jenny, honestly, the show is too short to describe all of her accolades and what she has done in her career so far. Jenny is a licensed physical therapist, a board-certified health and wellness coach, a functional medicine coach, a professional life coach, on and on and on. Just a wonderful human being. What we're going to be talking about today is going to be her work with the CIRS support group, what's called the CIRS Healing Collective. CIRS is a Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome. If you don't know, many listeners already suffer from this or know of it, but many, many more do not. And this is something that I think is going to be getting a lot of attention in the next few years because of just how timely it is. It has a lot to do with Lyme disease, with mold exposure, and we're now finding so much more out about it. And today, Jenny's going to talk to us about her work in that realm and how we can work with her. And so please welcome Jenny Johnson.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks so much, Andy. It was really fun having you on my show. You're a wealth of information. There's a lot of crossover in what we do, and I think in the people that we're talking with. So, it's an honor to be with you today.
Thank you so much. And so there's a couple things I want to touch on really quick. First of all, there's a lot of folks that'll be coming in today that know you, that already work with you. They're part of your program, but this, of course, goes out to the masses. And so there's going to be a lot of folks who don't know you. So if you can just give us a little bit about your background, how you got into this, and what's kind of what pointed you in this direction.
Yeah, sure. So for those of you who don't know, there's probably a title to this podcast, but my specialty right now is it's really mold illness. I am a CIRS coach. For people who know what that is, Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome is an actual medical term that's been given for people who've been in chronic low dose or, maybe short-term acute, dose, but water damage building exposure can lead to a nasty chronic illness with fatigue and body pain and brain fog and gut issues, all kinds of nasty things that our family actually went through. Gosh, I guess it was about almost 10 years ago now. And I'm a licensed physical therapist. My background is in biology. I have a bachelor's degree in biology, and then I got a master's degree in physical therapy. I've always been fascinated with this intersection of environmental health and human health. But again, long story short, my family all got sick about 10 years ago. And the reason why I bring up my background in physical therapy is I had never heard of mold illness or mold being, a problem for our health in all of my kind of conventional medicine and biology background. So when we started going down this rabbit trail, I'll say, as a family, I had this almost professional doubt of like, really, is this a thing? And I will answer for any of you who are listening, yes, it is a thing. And of course, paying attention to the chemicals and other kinds of toxicants that can be part of our external environment is huge. My focus is a little bit more on the biotoxins that can affect our indoor air. And that's really the space that I've shifted to ever since our family got well from this illness. I've moved away from practicing physical therapy, and I now serve as a coach and a consultant for folks who have all the same questions that I had, learning about mold illness and what all this means for their health and their home. So so that's what I'm doing now. That's hopefully enough about me.
That's fantastic. And quite honestly, it's fascinating because I can tell you that 30 years ago, when I started in this business, mold was simply just something you saw either outside or on a piece of fruit that you left out too long. It wasn't anything that was considered damaging to our health.
Right.
At least we didn't know at the time. We also thought at the time too that chemical sensitivity was essentially a disease of its own.
Yeah.
And now we're finding that it's just an underlying condition caused by something like CIRS or mast cell activation or dysautonomia or something like that. And so we're learning so much. And I guess my first question for you is, why all of a sudden is mold becoming like the topic when it comes to human health? It again, a few years ago, this wasn't even on the radar. Now it is like the number one topic. Matter of fact, for my consulting business, talking about new home construction and remodeling, mold is almost now the most important topic,
Wow.
beyond just the chemical issues.
Yeah, great question. And I think there's probably several reasons for that. The existence of health related issues due to mold is not really new. I mean, if it goes back to the Bible, I think it's in Leviticus, where there are actual biblical instructions for if there's mold, leave everything for 2 weeks. And if it's still there after you clean it in this way, then burn the house down. So it's not necessarily a new concept that mold in our homes can be harmful to our health. But I think, and I'm sure you're aware of this, Andy, as we started to build our houses a little bit differently with this whole kind of environmental health kind of movement to lower energy, the energy requirements of heating our home and cooling our home, we started building tighter homes. I want to say that was maybe, gosh, you would probably know better than
Yeah.
I, maybe in the 90s, 80s, something like
Yeah, I
that.
mean, it started in the 70s with the oil embargo, the
Okay.
OPEC oil embargo, and the cost of energy, and it kind of pushed then into the 80s, and then the 90s came this big resurgence of energy efficient construction.
Mhm.
And you're exactly right. Home builders got this idea that we need to build everything tight, but then it's like, oh, by the way, there's people trying to live in these homes too.
Yeah.
Hmm. Now what do we do? And so we're in this kind of strange situation where construction is sort of a hybrid of it sort of breathes, but it doesn't really breathe. And so we're still in this situation, but I think you're exactly right. This is where we've created our own problem.
Right, right. So our buildings have changed. So while we know the potential for this problem has been around forever, I think the way that we started building our buildings in the late, part of the last century made this more prevalent. So more people started developing these odd symptoms of like fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, even autism, ADHD, some of these kind of funky symptoms and syndromes that started popping up more around that time. And I wonder how much of those are related to just more impurities in our indoor air, just lack of, just the natural airflow that we've had in older building practices. And then, with your input, potentially new chemicals that are coming online. But on top of that, there's been a lot more, I think, awareness on the medical side. So I did my training with Dr. Richie Shoemaker, and he's the one who coined the term CIRS, or Chronic Inflammatory Response Syndrome, this biotoxin illness. And he stumbled upon this really by accident, and it wasn't initially by looking at moldy homes. It was actually looking at biotoxins in estuaries that some fishermen were getting exposed to and getting sick. Then he realized that their symptoms were very similar to some other people that he was working with that ended up being associated with mold in their homes, and the treatments were the same. But all this is to say that I think it was in the early to mid 2000s that he started to put together the research that people living in these damp buildings, exposed to mold and other biotoxins in damp buildings, all met this diagnostic criteria for CIRS, which looked very much like fibromyalgia and chronic fatigue. And he's been doing research ever since. Actually, that may have been in the late 1990s, not in the early 2000s. Um, Gosh, I'm thinking of my age and how like it all just feels like a blur. Like, same time frame, not really. But so he's been pumping out a ton of research. He's been training a lot of clinicians. This is starting to get taught in medical schools now, so more and more doctors have heard of it. It still has a long way to go. We don't have an ICD-10 code for mold illness yet, so that insurance companies can say, oh, yeah, we know what that is and we'll pay for it. Most of our PCPs our primary care physicians probably weren't trained in medical school. This is so new. It's like the new doctors who are going to be graduating in a few years. They may have been trained in this, but our current doctors are still having to choose whether or not they want to learn about this and accept it and start treating, or just just say, well, I didn't learn about it in medical school, so it can't be real. But there is a growing awareness, and it is such a public health issue. So many people are becoming ill from their homes, especially after COVID. All of us were stuck in our homes for so long. A lot of people ended up with weird illnesses after they were in their homes, for a long time. So I think there's a growing prevalence of it because of our buildings and because of COVID. And I think there's also a growing awareness. So more and more people are becoming aware that I think this might be why I have all these weird symptoms and what do I do next, right?
So, boy, that brings up so many new questions for me. But one of the things you touched on was whether or not there's actually a code attached to this for working with your insurance company and so forth. I remember years ago, MCS, or multiple chemical sensitivity, was like on the cusp of becoming a documented disease that could be treated and would be taught in medical school. Never got there. CIRS is something that I think has gone far beyond that. Is this now, and maybe this is me as a non-medical professional, is this now considered a documented disease, or is this something that is still, and I heard what you said about it, some people are trained on it, some people aren't. Where are we at with that?
Yeah, good question. Fair question. So Dr. Richie Shoemaker, through all of the research that he's done, he has actually established formal diagnostic criteria. So there's a formal name, formal diagnostic criteria, like you have to have these specific tests, blood labs out of range. You have to have, so many symptoms, and then you have to have a suspected exposure. So there's a formal way that we have to diagnose it technically. And then there's actually an evidence-based protocol to treat it. And so, I mean, he spent tons of time, I'm sure tons of money, looking at tens of thousands of people. So he developed a treatment protocol for this disease. And that's really the first step in having an established I think diagnosis that can get an ICD-10 code, and all doctors are going to learn about it. It's not as helpful if there's a nebulous name, a nebulous medical diagnosis that's not really, there's no consistent way to diagnose it, and there's no evidence-based way to treat it. So I think that's why he's worked so hard, or one of the reasons why he's worked so hard to put that research behind it so that it is now set up to be a formal diagnosis. So I think that I say they, there are individuals in a professional association that I'm involved with, the Surviving Mold Professional Association, who are working really hard to get it to be an established ICD-10 code. And that's really what we need. It used to be ICD-9, now we're on ICD-10. These are the diagnosis codes that doctors can put, like, when they visit with us and they diagnose us with something, they'll apply a code to it. And then that's kind of what insurance sees as a billable. Oh, okay, so they have this illness, it has a code, and here's how we're going to reimburse for it. So we don't yet have that code for CIRS, but there are other codes that doctors who treat this illness can fairly use, like there are codes for chronic pain or general inflammation or chronic headaches and gut issues. So they're going more off of the symptoms. There are codes for those. But it'll be really nice once we actually have a code for CIRS or biotoxin illness or MCS.
Mm-hmm.
So that in itself, can be a recognized diagnosis. Yeah.
So at this point, it really still comes down to finding somebody who has the knowledge base, has the willingness to dig deeper, because your average, GP is not going to be able to, or will not have the desire to even travel down this road with you, I'd assume.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. I would say so. There are some who are open-minded. In our family, it was actually my son was one of the first of us to get sick. And when I took him to his pediatrician, just a regular allopathic doctor, and we explained his symptoms, she's the one who picked up on the fact that the symptoms were kind of across systems. So it wasn't all gut or all pulmonary or all skin or all neurological. It was a little bit of everything. And that was a red flag to her that this may be an environmental illness. And so she said, where does he go to school? What kind of building is it? She had had some training in sick building syndrome. And so it was actually our PCP, not at all aware of mold illness, really, but kind of bringing this idea of, I wonder if it's the building. Let's test for radon and lead paint and asbestos. She was kind of going down that path. Maybe it's some kind of chemical. And then through additional research, that's where we learned of Dr. Richie Shoemaker's website, Surviving Mold, and realized, oh, it could be mold. So we tested for that. And that's the one that was off the charts of all the various things that we tested for. So there are some curious, open-minded PCPs out there. Maybe they've heard the term sick building syndrome. Maybe they look at our symptoms and say, this is really weird. This isn't just, I'm not going to put the label chronic fatigue on this. That's really a symptom.
Right.
That's not a diagnosis. Why do you have chronic fatigue? Or why do you have body pain? Why do you have insomnia? And so, the field of functional medicine or integrative medicine, those are two fields that doctors who have been trained in those areas have been trained to look at all of the symptoms or all of the systems, I'm sorry, how they interrelate, and then how to look for contributing factors like root causes rather than just putting a label on a symptom and saying, there you go, you've got chronic pain. So you're right. Sometimes we need to go to a specialist, like a functional medicine doctor or an integrative medicine doctor, for them to be curious enough to look a little bit deeper and ask the why. But then even beyond that, there are doctors who specialize in biotoxin illness. And that's even another layer beyond, I'll say, just functional medicine or integrative medicine, people who have some kind of formal training in this, because it's not for the faint of heart. It's pretty confusing, and patient presentations can be really different and strange, and we don't want to hurt anybody. And so, being in a professional association of other doctors and environmental specialists who are treating this illness, learning from each other, doing research to learn more, that can be really helpful. So for folks who have these symptoms, the Surviving Mold website has a list of certified practitioners. And then the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illnesses, ISEAI.org, is another website where you can maybe find a practitioner who knows more than the average PCP or even the average functional medicine doctor about environmental illnesses.
Well, that's great. I'll make sure to put those links in the notes as this gets
Awesome.
posted to social media in the next couple of weeks. Quick question came up in the chat. PCP, is that personal care physician?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Yep.
Excellent.
Sorry for using lingo. So that's just a regular doctor that maybe our insurance company assigns us to, who we're going to go to when we have a cold. Our main doctor. Yeah. So a lot of us need to go beyond that.
Right. And so in your description of this, one of the questions I had on my list to ask is, how do you diagnose for chronic inflammatory response? But it sounds to me like there is no hard and fast rule of how to diagnose. Like there's no specific test. It's a series of tests and questions and inspections and so forth.
Yeah. Well, that's where there's a little bit of a difference between CIRS, the CIRS, that Dr. Shoemaker coined, and then more of a broader bucket of just environmentally acquired illnesses, or, mast cell, multiple chemical sensitivity. There's more of a bucket of more broad terms, but CIRS actually does have formal diagnostic criteria. Okay. There are a series of labs that are explained on the Surviving Mold website. And I want to say, there are some of them that can be diagnostic and some that are more ancillary. But out of we'll say the diagnostic bucket of blood labs that we can have done at like LabCorp or Quest, if 4 or more of them are out of range, and if you have a certain amount of symptoms, so there's something called the symptom cluster analysis. I can give you more information about that if you want. But there's this array of symptoms that Dr. Shoemaker has put into a chart. And as you go through and you answer which symptoms you have and don't have, basically, if you have 8 or more symptoms in a certain arrangement is what I'll say, like certain boxes that are different colors. If you have 8 or more different clusters, then that is criteria number 2. So we have 4 dysregulated labs, 8 or more positive symptom clusters, and then known or suspected exposure. And so,
Okay.
do you live in a home with visible mold or water damage? Or have you done some kind of test, a dust sample, or have you had a professional come and do some sampling? Yes, in fact, you do, have mold exposure. So known or expected exposure to
Okay.
a biotoxin would be the third piece.
So
Yeah.
I seem to recall maybe about a year ago working with a mold inspector, and who also is fairly familiar with the Shoemaker protocols. And I had a client who had mycotoxin issues, and
Sure.
so his the mold inspector's response to her was, according even to Shoemaker, it's not a building material related issue. It's probably from a foodborne source of mold exposure. And
Okay.
so I only bring this up because, and it's a controversial issue, I believe, because
Yeah.
there are some people who say that the testing for mycotoxins, whether it's blood or urine testing, I believe that they can be inconclusive because
Yeah.
of what you were consuming. And so
Right.
could it be that I mean, I would imagine so, but it's probably a combination of these things. It's probably not just one particular issue.
Yeah, I think you're talking about the urine mycotoxin test. I think there's also a blood test that looks for antibodies to mold. That can be another test some people do. Those are not the labs that I'm speaking about that Dr. Shoemaker has based his research on. They can be somewhat helpful, but really hard to interpret for the reasons that you said. So we can go and pee in a cup and send it to a lab, and they'll tell us what mycotoxins are in it, but we don't know if they came from our house, came from something we ate, came from the grocery store, or are from 6 months ago when we were on vacation. We're not even sure how long they persist. And so it tells us what we've been exposed to,
Mm-hmm.
but then it leaves you with a whole bunch of questions. So the labs that I'm talking about are blood labs that are looking for a fingerprint of what mold exposure would do to your physiology. So what would it do to your immune system and your hormones and things like that? So Dr. Shoemaker has learned that people with mold exposure, inhalational mold exposure, tend to have certain labs, certain immune markers that are off, and certain hormones that are off. And so that's really what we're looking at, more indirect measures of mold exposure rather than looking for mycotoxins in the urine, because that's so tricky. Like you said, it can be helpful, it can be like, okay, I think I'm on the right path, but then it just begs a whole lot more questions. You're right.
Well, it can also lead to that whole fight or flight response of, oh
Yeah.
my gosh, I'm riddled with mycotoxins. I got to get out of my house. It's very similar to a situation where somebody does an indoor air quality test and finds that their house is full of VOCs and immediately goes into that panic mode.
Right.
Whereas, if they actually looked at what happened in the house in the 2 hours previous to doing the VOC test, somebody cut open an orange for breakfast and it released 2,000
My
milligrams per liter of
goodness.
VOCs.
Oh gosh. Wow. I didn't know it could be that immediate. That's crazy. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
I've had clients with this where they're doing an indoor air quality test, and during the time they were outside cutting the grass, and they jumped inside really quick to grab something off a counter and went back outside, and all of a sudden the VOC test comes back with just ultra toxic levels of gasoline fumes from that
Wow.
brief interaction of just going inside, not even near the test equipment. And so you
Wow.
really have to be mindful of how those tests are being performed. And then it comes down to having a professional interpret the test properly
Right.
instead of just
Right.
looking at these numbers. So I look at
And here's
somebody,
one interesting thing,
yeah,
Andy, about that urine mycotoxin test. If you do that test and it comes back like showing that, there are a variety of mycotoxins in your urine, that could actually be good news for you. And what I mean by that is it could mean that your body is really doing what it's supposed to. It was
hmm,
exposed to some nasty things somewhere. Maybe you went on vacation, or the grocery store is undergoing some renovation, or your church, and you were exposed. You breathe those things out in, and your body did exactly what it was supposed to do and excreted them out of the urine.
hmm,
Boom, that's what we want. What can be more concerning is when people suspect they've had mold exposure, or maybe there's even mold in their house, they do a urine sample and it comes back clean. Does that really mean they're not in exposure? Does that mean their body could be holding on to those toxins? So sometimes it's the negative results that the sicker people have because they're not able to eliminate those biotoxins properly. And that's the population that the Shoemaker protocol works with the most, those of us who don't detox very well, and we're actually holding on to those toxins. And then our body becomes very inflamed as a result of these stored toxins throughout our body. We wish we could pee them out. So again, just another way of saying that particular test can beg a lot of questions, not one to hang your hat on, but it can be helpful in some ways.
I greatly appreciate you saying this because I am one to, whenever there is a test that comes out that I can order and do myself, just because I want to know about it, because I know my clients are going to ask about it. So about, I don't know, 6 months ago, 8 months ago, I did the mycotoxin urine test.
Yeah.
And I came back just loaded with ochratoxin A and all these other, but I have no other symptoms,
Right.
no other symptoms whatsoever. And so I started just doing all the research I could, like what's the exposure? How can I get rid of this? So on and so forth. And I thought, well, maybe I just don't have um, an issue with this. My body is able to, like you say, filter it out. And that's why it comes into the test results. So I appreciate you saying all this.
Yeah. It just may have been, that you ate some grains or dried fruit or coffee or chocolate or wine
Right.
or beer. A lot
Right.
of the normal foods that we have ochratoxin A in it, and we want to be able to dump that. Now, the problem is if we're having really weird symptoms and we're trying to figure out why. And so getting to the root of that could be helpful, but I think that there are better tests than the urine mycotoxin test to help get to the root of symptoms.
So a couple of things you brought up, I want to touch on. Number one, the sizable increase, I think, in people talking about this and then coming to you since the pandemic.
Yeah.
It was estimated that we spent about 90% of our lives indoors. That was prior to the pandemic. Now we're stuck at the kitchen table where kids are doing homework, you're doing, Zoom work, and that we're all in this environment. And we've seen this, our business from a material supply side of things really increased throughout the pandemic because so many people were stuck at home and they just had nothing else to do besides maybe do some remodeling. So I can see how this has been, the pandemic has exacerbated this mold exposure,
Mhm.
chemical exposure, and now people are looking for answers.
Yeah.
Um, could it also be that either the virus itself has actually triggered something within the body that we didn't know existed? Could it be the therapeutics that were used by a lot of people that triggered something? I mean, there's got to be some relation here, just besides the fact that we're now just more quote unquote aware.
Yeah. Oh, you bring up some really important points, and there's some delicacy here. We're still learning a lot, but yes, we've seen a lot more of environmental illness, mold exposure since COVID, and part of that is because everybody was, at home and maybe not having the variety of indoor air quality. Some at work, outside, vacation, a little bit at home. But when you're in one environment, and if that happens to be an impacted environment where a less than ideal environment, that's all we're breathing, we have a greater likelihood of them becoming symptomatic. But the virus itself, yes, and even people who've gotten the vaccine, we're seeing some people who have new symptoms that didn't go away. We call it post, long haul COVID or post COVID syndrome. Same thing with the vaccine. There are some people who develop chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia after getting the vaccine. So we need to ask, how did these inputs, the virus itself, or maybe the vaccine, do something to our immune system to create a shift where now we're different than we were before? And I think there's still a lot that we're learning. And this isn't my forte, so I don't want to overspeak. But the concept that Dr. Richie Shoemaker put forth with CIRS is that we are all born with many genes, but one of the genes actually can make us susceptible to CIRS or not. And we're born with it in the off position. And so when we're little, we're detoxing mold toxins just normally until some kind of trigger, some kind of priming event turns that gene on. And now we are no longer able to tolerate the home that we've always been in, that we used to be able to tolerate just fine. And that what triggers that gene into the on position can be an inflammatory illness. So that's COVID. It can be a primer to the immune system, which can be a vaccine. So I'm not saying that the vaccine is necessarily bad, but for some of us, it can be that trigger to our immune system. It's asking a lot of our immune system to recognize this foreign agent, to create new antibodies. And that can be enough to prime a gene into the on position so that now suddenly we're not tolerating our home and we're not detoxing mold toxins properly. So, that's one idea, that COVID or the vaccine could actually be triggering a new intolerance to biotoxins that we didn't used to have.
It's interesting. I remember 25 years ago giving a presentation at a large architectural event, and the topic came up on how does somebody become multiply chemically sensitive? How does somebody develop MCS? And I talked about the ways that we knew at the time. Usually it's massive exposure to either a pesticide, to a fertilizer, or Legionella, Legionnaire's disease, massive exposure. It could also be a change in the body chemistry because of a large medical condition, whether it's major surgery, childbirth, a car accident, something that changes the body chemistry. And then the other one would be low-level exposure over a long period of time. That's probably the most prevalent way that somebody develops chemical sensitivity, because it's how most of us over time we say, I just can't tolerate this stuff anymore. And so now I hear you talking about this where it's just, wow, very, very similar, similar situation.
Yeah. And I'll add to it, it's usually more than just one thing. And so, maybe it was the COVID infection that then triggered this gene, but there's usually also some exposure going on. And there's usually a perfect storm of other things, other stressors. So are we also not sleeping well? Have we lost a loved one? Are we in the middle of a divorce? Do we have some food intolerances that we're kind of ignoring, or just, not eating all that great? So there are a variety of things, and you kind of talked about this, almost like the chemistry of the system at the time, and that's something that I love dealing with, is what I call the inner environment. How can we fortify the inner environment to be more resilient in this world that is imperfect? It's going to have chemicals and biotoxins and EMFs. And I would love to reel that back and make it cleaner, but I don't know that we're going in that direction. But how can we develop more capacity and resilience to those things by controlling the factors that we do have some control over? Now, we can't, control the death of a loved one or something, but we can control our sleep and our stress management and our mindset, and what we choose to eat, and are we moving, our level of fitness. These things are helpful in building that capacity so that we can flow with the things that come our way and could take us down.
My personal care physician years ago, and unfortunately she retired, so I can't go to her anymore, but she was very big into sort of the Eastern methodologies as well. And she always said that everything that I was coming in, or everything that was happening with my body, can all be related to stress in one way or another. And then my best friend is a physical therapist, and he owned a series of physical therapy clinics here in Wisconsin, and he is now retired. But every time I see him, he talks about how it's stress. It is everything's interrelated.
Yeah.
He talks about body electricity, And so he does see a lot of, or he used to see many of my own customers who are
Yeah.
dealing with chemical sensitivity and mold
Yeah.
exposure and so forth, and now they're running into um, problems with chronic fatigue and sleep issues
Yeah.
and whatnot. And
Yeah.
again, it's amazing how so many of these things now are starting to combine into this school of thought that now seems to make more sense than it ever did before. Before it
Yeah.
seems to be all these outline issues, and now there seems to be some continuity with the
Yeah.
ideas, and hopefully that means continuity with moving forward. How do we not only uh, treat, but even more importantly, how do we prevent?
Yes. Yep. Absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. I agree with everything you just said, Andy. It was beautiful.
So one thing you touched on briefly, and I really wanted to talk about this, and specifically because I had a call this morning with actually somebody who is also working with you, and he heard us talk on your show, and so we're discussing some things today. And one of the things that I came up with is, um, I think issues that he is having, it could be because he has horrible issues with mold, but I think it's
Mhm.
being exacerbated because of electromagnetic fields.
Mhm.
And that's something that they really haven't looked into yet.
Yeah.
And so I have heard from people over the years that electromagnetic fields can make chronic inflammatory response even worse. Um,
Yeah.
and more, I think, concentrated in this is electromagnetic fields caused by cell towers and Wi-Fi, not just wiring and electronics in your home, because those can only travel so far, but radio waves, microwaves that can travel long distances and penetrate deep into the cells. And so, have you seen more emphasis being put on this from your colleagues around the country?
Yes and no. So, more so in the International Society for Environmentally Acquired Illnesses, the professionals in that group are looking beyond biotoxins, more into chemicals and EMFs and heavy metals and agricultural stuff, more so than the surviving mold professional community, which is a little bit more focused on biotoxins, Lyme and bacteria and mold. But yeah, for the professional group, the ICI professional group, absolutely, EMF is getting more and more talked about, and especially as 5G has been rolled out, and there's been a lot of talk about that, and more people becoming sensitive as we just have more and more towers and inputs. So I think, again, that's not an area of forte, but of mine, but it's definitely an area of interest because I think it's just another contributing factor that can dysregulate our system, and maybe bother our cellular milieu, about bother our capacity and our resilience to even handle other issues that come our way. For some people, it might even be the primary issue. Most of my clients who have issues with EMFs, their symptoms seem to be more pronounced when they're in like a direct exposure to EMFs, but then if they leave and go on vacation, it's totally better. So it's not the kind of toxins that they carry around with them in their body, and it doesn't seem to have the long-term physiological effects that, that at least I know that biotoxins can. They can actually cause some disruption to our physiology where we don't necessarily feel better when we go on vacation because we bring the problem with us. But with EMF, some people I'll ask, do you feel better when you get out into the woods or when you go to the beach or, and sometimes if the answer is yes, then we have to start digging into other things besides biotoxins. Could it be EMFs or chemicals? But yeah, absolutely. I've heard even, I think it was Dietrich Klinghardt, Dr. Klinghardt, who did a little research, and I don't know if this has been verified, but it's interesting nonetheless that even like mold is alive, bacteria is alive, and when it is in our house, even if it's not visible, it's behind a wall or under a floorboard or behind the shower or something like that. But when there's mold in our living environment, and there's also elevated EMFs going on, the mold feels threatened. by the EMFs too, because it's alive and it's feeling dysregulated from these electromagnetic fields coming its way. And when mold feels threatened, that's when it emits its mycotoxins as like biological warfare. It thinks that there's something to fight. It thinks something is trying to kill it, so it's trying to fight back. And so there's this theory that mold can become more toxic in the presence of EMFs, potentially even chemicals. I would think so. Like there's a lot of talk about how if we spray bleach or other chemicals at mold, it's going to feel threatened and probably emit more mycotoxins. So it's interesting when we've got multiple things going on in our house, right? EMFs, biotoxins, chemicals, they can then interrelate way more than in Bible times when it was maybe just the mold,
Hmm.
right? We've now got more stuff going on, and then we're sitting in the middle of it with,
Hmm.
where with all these things going on, and we can feel it.
Well, any living organism, the 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 common drive is to survive
Yep.
with any living organism. And when living organisms feel threatened, that's when they try to branch out. Humans, they populate. Where it's all natural to any living organism to do this. And yes, we see that's with mold remediation. You can't just throw a chemical at it because
Yeah.
it's quite possible that throwing a chemical at it may clean the mold off the surface. What was created in the mix was the mycotoxin release. And
Right.
so, we work with a very specific product called Callowell. And this is not a plug here, but I use this as an example because this question comes up all the time. When you do a traditional mold remediation and you're scrubbing and rinsing and sanding and this and that, it's quite possible that actually causes the mycotoxin release. Um, Using the Callowell product, because of the high pH, it kills the mold and kills the mycotoxin. It just takes care of everything at once. So there is no mycotoxin release. And that's what's so important about using that product in the protocol. Um, Couple things also to follow up. I just wanted to ask everybody who is listening right now, if they have any questions, please go into the chat and leave them. I see some people are leaving some comments. I appreciate that. Any other questions for Jenny, please put them in the chat and we'll try to get to them before this is over. So bacterial infection versus fungal infection. Can you talk a little bit about the differences and then how they relate with CIRS?
Yeah. So are you talking about bacterial infection of the home?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a new thing, newer for sure. And I think that Dr. Shoemaker was really humble. His website is, well, I don't think he's the owner of this website, but his organization is Surviving Mold. He wrote the book Surviving Mold and Mold Warriors. But when he started to realize that it's not just mold, well, he's known for a long time that it's not just mold. There are many different inflammagens in a water damaged building. But it was really over the last maybe 4 or 5 years that he's realized that bacteria, in particular, endotoxins and actinomycetes,
Mm-hmm.
are just as powerful in causing human illness in a water damaged building, and maybe even more so than mold. And so he's been humble enough to make that public. And he's gotten some pushback from that. Like, wait, I thought you were the mold guy and you wrote books about mold and we're on the mold bandwagon. Now you're saying it's bacteria. It's not that it's not mold, but I think this is actually good news for those of us who've been kind of like trying to just address the mold, and maybe we're not getting all the way better. And we realize there's some other players here, and we need to also be looking at the bacteria. So the two that we're looking at right now are endotoxins and actinomycetes. Endotoxins, can be elevated in a water damaged building if the water damage came from like a category 2 or 3 water event. And so that means dirty water. So like an overflowed toilet, spread to the drywall and maybe created some microbial growth on the backside of the drywall. That's probably not just mold, but it's going to be bacteria. Or a flood,
Yep.
hurricane, flood, dirty water coming in from outside, or a broken drain pipe on a dishwasher. That happened to me a couple of years ago. It filled up my basement wall, this little crack in my dishwasher drain pipe. dirty water from the
Mm-hmm.
dishwasher filled up my wall. Well, that wasn't just mold, that was bacteria. And it can also come from non-water damaged events. So if we have indoor pets that occasionally have fecal accidents, cat litter, puppies, old dogs, or even toddlers or elderly in diapers, and I was a young mom once. You're changing their diapers, kids' diapers on the carpet or the couch sometimes, and you're doing the best you can. But can there be some aerosolization of fecal, of endotoxins?
Yeah.
Well, that can actually make people sick. That can cause indoor air quality issues where we can actually develop biotoxin illness, the fibromyalgia, the fatigue, the body pain, the brain fog, the gut issues from this indoor endotoxin exposure. It can also come from sewer gas leaks, where there's just like a loose connection in some of our pipes where we have a little bit of leakage, maybe out from our shower drain or something like that, where some sewer gases are coming in the wrong direction and they're
Mm-hmm.
coming into our house. Sometimes we can smell it, sometimes we can't. But those can all be sources of endotoxin exposure. And so that's one new thing. And we can actually test for that in a dust sample. And we can do blood tests on ourselves to see if we are currently reacting to endotoxins. So there's a cool test called the Genie. It's really expensive right now, and I'm hoping the price comes down, but it tells us all this really cool information that will tell us, are you currently reacting to mycotoxins, endotoxins, or actinomycetes? And it's looking at our gene activity, which genes are kind of upregulated or down regulated right now that might demonstrate a fingerprint of, yeah, okay, you look like somebody who is being exposed to endotoxins right now versus mycotoxins. Actinos are a whole nother beast. That's another kind of bacteria, and that can be present in a water damaged building. It can also be from soil. But what we're finding is it tends to make people the sickest when it is coming from our own bodies. And that's crazy.
Yeah.
So what we're thinking, what the current thought is that a lot of us end up with a dysregulated immune system from a different exposure, let's say mold exposure, water damage building, maybe an endotoxin exposure, maybe even chemicals or EMFs. I don't know. We don't know yet. But something causes this immune system dysregulation where we start to produce a dysbiotic proportion of these bacteria, kind of like we can have dysbiosis in the gut. It's
Mm-hmm.
the same thing, but it's on our skin. So we start to, we shed bacteria every day in our skin, but it can become dysbiotic when we're sick, for lack of a better word. And so when we are shedding a lot of these actinos in our skin that happen to be pathogenic, and then we breathe them back in, it can actually cause CIRS. It can cause these symptoms of chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, brain fog, or it can perpetuate those. So the problem may have started with mold exposure. We fix that, and then we wonder why we're still sick. And it could be that we are shedding these bacteria into our environment.
Wow.
So what that requires is we need to continue working to regulate our immune system, fix any gut dysbiosis that may be going on, continue detoxing, work on the nervous system to manage stress. We want to be producing less of these actinos. And then we need to clean up after ourselves so that we're breathing in less of what we put into our environment. So we're vacuuming and wiping and cleaning our drains and washing our clothes more frequently. Usually that's a somewhat short term, like maybe 6 month kind of a thing. And then we can break that cycle and be done with it. But
Wow.
really wacky, right? When we learn
Yeah.
that we can become part of the problem, we can perpetuate the illness with our own skin cells, basically.
Right. Absolutely fabulous. A fascinating discussion here because, I think this is a portion that we're just dipping into right now. Is
Yeah.
from our perspective as a building material supply perspective. We find that there can be a bacterial infection in your HVAC system,
Mhm.
specifically in the drip pans. And so
Right.
it's not just mold in the ductwork. It can
Yeah.
actually be a bacterial situation in the drip pan. So we've been working with a company that makes like these strips so you can put into the drip pan that kills off the bacteria. Now,
Cool.
is it 100%, safe for humans to be around it. I mean, generally speaking, yes, I wouldn't want to put one on my arm and keep it on my arm for a period of time. But
Mhm.
in your system, it's very effective and very needed.
Cool.
A couple of notes came up here. People reacting to your
Uh-oh.
words, Jenny. Thank you
I
so much
haven't
for.
looked at the chat. I hope I didn't overwhelm or
Oh
really confuse
no,
anybody.
great job of breaking down the complex topic. Coral saying that mold reacts to EMF and potential chemicals like bleach and feels threatened and emits biotoxins to survive and will become even more dangerous. Yes, exactly right.
Mhm.
I've heard that before where, the layman's way to say it is when you try to bleach mold, you might clean off the color, but it doesn't kill the root. So
Yeah.
there's a difference between mildew, which is basically just surface mold that can be wiped off very easily, and mold, which is actually mildew now that it's taken root and is part of the surface. So yes, you definitely have to be
Yeah.
worried about that.
Yeah.
We only have a few minutes left, so I want to touch on one of the questions that came up.
Sure.
There was a question asking if you can maybe contrast the approaches from Dr. Shoemaker to Dr. Neil Nathan, if you have
Mhm.
any experience with that and if you have any opinion on that.
Yeah, fair question. And I think it's tricky for us as, we'll say, consumers or patients, individuals trying to figure out, where do I go for help? It seems like the professionals are split and there's all this information on the internet and it seems conflicting. Back when our family was sick, there was such little information on the internet about this. It was really just Shoemaker's work. And so that's what the path that we went down and that I've become more trained in. But as we're getting more information, more and more doctors are starting to kind of come up with their own method of looking at this and treating this. And, I like to stay in touch with both organizations, Surviving Mold and ICI, and glean the best of the best, because I think they both are really doing good work. What I like about Shoemaker's approach is it is very validated, meaning there's a lot of evidence behind each step. That doesn't mean it's going to work the exact same way for every person or that it's cookie cutter. It just means that there's a step-by-step approach that is all based on objective data. So you do a lab, for like every step. And when it's time to move on to the next step based on either your environmental scores, like you do a dust sample and it turns out it's a certain score or less. Okay, you're ready to move on to the next step. And you might do that until you've achieved a certain lab result, and then we know you're ready for the next step. So it's very systematic and organized. I like that. Maybe I'm type A. But there's a lot of research about how going in this step-by-step, I guess, manner is very helpful, and it can save a lot of time and money. The Shoemaker protocol, a lot of things are covered by insurance. A lot of the labs, they're not super fancy. Except for the Genie, the one that I did mention, it is very expensive and not covered by insurance. And then things are personalized for the Shoemaker protocol. As you're going up the ladder, it's really a pyramid, the Shoemaker protocol. There's going to be some personalization because some people might be able to skip a step or two because of what their labs and symptoms are showing. And so they can skip to another level. Or if there's some gut issues going on, or hormone issues going on, or sleep apnea, or blood glucose dysregulations, other infections, those can be treated along the way. So so I just wanted to dispel that myth that the Shoemaker protocol is cookie cutter, because it's really not, especially if you're working with a doctor who also has maybe an integrative or functional medicine background and can look at some additional things besides just the detox protocol. And I think that's really what Neil Nathan did, is he kind of looked at the core of the Shoemaker protocol, which is very detox oriented. And he said, well, what about all these other things that could be going on? What about other gut infections? What about mast cell? What about the nervous system? What about, heavy metals? What about Lyme? What about other biochemical imbalances? And so I think he was one of the first to kind of formally, um, you know, care about the detox protocol, but then want to integrate other things in there to make sure that we didn't miss other important things along the way that could serve as obstacles. So I see both approaches as very similar
Hmm.
now because so many of the shoemaker doctors are also integrating those things. Yet, unfortunately, whenever there's kind of a split in philosophies and in actual professional groups, sometimes there's some bad blood and fallout there. But they're both doing really good things. I will
Yeah.
say that the folks who are following the Neil Nathan strategy, they may end up spending a little more money because a lot of the doctors following that protocol, um, they'll add in a lot of things that aren't covered by insurance, IVs and really fancy supplements and really fancy tests that no one's heard of, and they're not as evidence-based as a Shoemaker
Sure.
protocol. So you could
Sure.
go to one doctor and it's totally different than another doctor. And so you got to really have a good trust in your doctor that they're not benefiting from what they're asking you to do, and that they really have done this, what they're recommending to you, they've used on other patients and it has worked. So that's my only kind of caveat with that approach, is that you could be a guinea pig, you could spend a lot more money.
Sure.
It's not as evidence-based, but there's a lot of cool stuff out there that's more cutting edge. Maybe not yet evidence-based, but cutting edge. And that's how we find out about new things, by pushing the envelope. So
Well,
I think there's good things in both camps.
I mean, essentially, it's just like modern medicine in any regard. I had a shoulder replacement several years ago. I went to three different orthopedic surgeons, and I got three different methods that they wanted to do to ultimately have the same goal.
Right.
And so there's, I think that's why you sometimes get multiple opinions of things.
Yeah.
And you find somebody you trust, and that's what I did. I found somebody who I trusted, that for me, whatever the reason was, made the most sense to
Yeah.
me, and that's what I ran with. Was
Yeah.
it the right way? Well, I think it was the right way for me.
Right.
And so
Right.
you have to pick something, because if you don't, if you keep on going back and forth, like, which one should I do? You're never going
Yeah.
to get anywhere. You're
Right.
spinning your
Right.
wheels.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's totally fair. I agree. Yeah.
So, last question I want to ask before we go is, we had a discussion in our circle community several months ago, and there's really some strong opinions in both directions on this. I'm kind of curious to know, and I'm not saying that, oh, she said this, so but I want to know if you've had experience with this or similar versions of it. The Annie Hopper's program, the dynamic neural retraining.
Yeah.
I personally have had customers who have gone through it and absolutely swear by it, changed their life. They're living in their homes today, and they never thought they would be able to get there. And I have others said they tried it and it was just an absolute disaster for them. I understand it's kind of like we just talked about, finding somebody that you can work with, finding a program that just seems to
Mhm.
work well for you. But
Yeah.
in my, again, layman's non-medical opinion, I deal with this every single day with clients when I have to kind of talk them down a little bit and say, it's nothing that's actually hazardous or toxic or anything that actually cause a reaction, but your brain is telling you this is a problem. Therefore, I'm putting the body
Mhm.
into fight or flight. So, what is your opinion about that
Yeah.
method, and then maybe others that are similar to it?
Yeah. I'm so glad that you brought that up. A little while ago, I shared the importance of our inner environment and building resilience and capacity to handle what's coming at us from our outer environment. And I think that these nervous system or limbic system retraining programs can have great value if done at the right time. I would never suggest to do it instead of fixing your exposures, to a reasonable level. I don't want to try to biohack my way out of a toxic exposure, whether it's super high levels of chemicals, EMFs, mold, because then you can't have a bad day. What happens when you've got to go have surgery, or you do get COVID, or you break up with your boyfriend or something, and now you kind of lost your house of cards, and now you get sick again? Like, so I think of those limbic system retraining programs really as icing on the cake. After we've done what we can to get out of exposure, now let's build our resilience so that we can decrease our reactivity. So CIRS, like MCS, it's an illness of immunoreactivity. So it's usually not because the toxins are so much worse than the neighbor's house sometimes, but it's like we are reacting to these toxins in such a crazy way. One of the ways we can react less to them is by training our nervous system to have different associations with these toxins, and using mindset practices, meditations, breath work, visualizations, and then even towards the end of these programs, practicing keeping our cool in low levels of exposure. It's really kind of like Wim Hof, like, cold exposure. Can we keep our cool while we're in a cold shower or, in an ice bath? And that is working on our nervous system capacity to handle stress. So I think it's especially helpful for folks who maybe they've gone through the whole detox thing, and they've gotten themselves into a clean place, but they still just feel really nervous all the time, or really afraid of going out, and it's becoming almost like an OCD thing, or they feel like they react to even very small exposures, or even just the thought of mold. Those people can really benefit a lot from a program like this, to retrain those associations so that we can calm down that fear response and find more of that parasympathetic nervous system state more often. The more times that we can be in that green zone, the better we're going to sleep, detox, digest our food. It's the healing state. And so these programs really teach us how to put our bodies into more of a healing state and out of that fight and flight. Again, not a replacement for treating your house and your, detoxing, but can be great icing on the cake. So DNRS, Gupta program. There's a new one I think called Primal Trust that I've heard good things about. I do some concierge limbic or nervous system work with folks using heart math and mindset work. Whatever route you go, I think if this is speaking to you, especially if you have a history of trauma, I would say do some research and dabble into these things. I've heard that some programs are a little bit more gentle than others, meaning more permissive, more kind. If you're looking into one of these programs and they use phrase like boot camp, that might not be helpful in calming down a fear response. So different people are going to be oriented to different things. But if you tried one program and it wasn't the thing for you, but you're still kind of interested in this concept, maybe try a different program that has a slightly different feel to it. They do have different feels.
Wow, fantastic. Wonderful information. I could go on for another hour, and I'm sure we will have another talk, hopefully sometime soon. What is the best way? Because I get a lot of people are asking, how do they work with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So I can be found in two main places. The first and foremost is Simplified Wellness Designs. And that's my website, and you can read more about my background and the various services that I provide. I do educational programs, support groups, one-on-one services for coaching and consulting. And then I have another website called Salugenics. And that's working more with the inner environment, with the healthy population and the chronic illness population. I'm pretty passionate about leveling up our inner terrain so that we can handle the stressors of life. And so that's actually a slightly different business that I have, Salugenex, Salugenics. Connect with me if you have any questions, or if this content resonated with you. I'd love to hear your story if you're listening. Simplifiedwellnessdesigns.com is the best way.
And you have a really, really strong support group that you've
I
started.
do.
And
Yeah.
that's what I was on a few weeks ago, and it was just fabulous. The interaction with the people who are in your group has been wonderful, and so I really encourage people to join.
Yeah, it's called the CIRS Healing Collective. So if you think you may have mold illness, I call it CIRS. If that resonates with you, check out the CIRS Healing Collective. We are a support group, and we meet each week on Zoom to share what we're learning and what we're feeling, and to try to not reinvent the wheel, but to learn together and to support each other along the way. And we brought in Andy. We bring in expert guests every month, and they loved that session with you. That was a huge hit with my group. So that was a fun session we had with you, Andy. Thanks for that.
Of course. Well, thank you for your time today, for your expertise, and for really digging into some of these details of things that have been, really having me think over the last several years now, and you've shed a lot of light on these subjects, and I really look forward to having you back on the show sometime soon.
Wonderful.
Jenny, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. This has been great to chat. I want to bring you back in my group too. I felt the same way. We need to have a round two.
Yeah,
so
definitely.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure to talk with you, Andy.
Excellent.
Thanks for having me on.